we are in the Retiro Park in Madrid.
In Madrid, in a garden.
Which is very much like Strand's garden in Orgeval, which was quite park-like, actually. So it's wonderful. Strand always returned to nature. You see,
yes.
The earliest photograph in the exhibition is a beautiful photograph he made in Central Park in New York, or one of the parks in New York. He made many pictures in Central Park, and then of course his nature studies in the 20s in Maine were so important. And the Orgeval photographs are a return to that motif.
Yeah, the circle.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting at the beginning of the show in that period, how he was using different languages at the same time, from the abstraction prints to the street photography, or like this series of portraits of these people from the street, like blind woman.
Yes.
And it's exactly, it's 1916?
It's all at the same moment, yes. Well, if you look at the chronology, Strand had a very long period of preparation. I'll call it his apprenticeship, where he sort of mastered the craft of photography, and he learned how to use the camera. And he made pictorialist photographs for a number of years. And I think in 1915, once he had been to the Armory show, in 1913, and he started to really absorb what was going on in the modern art movements, especially with Cubism, which his mentor Stieglitz was so excited about. Strand was ready to move in several directions. And so within a year, he first of all, he began photographing the city in a very ambitious way. He also began to experiment that same year with real abstraction in photography, mostly with still life arrangements. And those were, he really thought of those as his Cubist experiments, and was very proud of them, but saw them really as a stage towards the work he wanted to make. And the photograph White Fence is really a culmination of his thinking about abstraction, because he wanted to explore photography's capacity to abstract the world, to just take shapes and forms. It seems that he had been thinking for some time about photographing people in the street, and he wanted to make anonymous portraits where people were unaware of him. This was difficult for Strand because he was a very methodical photographer. He really operated like a studio photographer. And of course, if you're photographing people secretly, you can't do that. He modified his camera. He put a fake lens on it so that it would look like he was aiming the camera in one direction, when in fact he was aiming it in another direction. And he sort of hid it under his coat. And it's clear that he was outside of his comfort zone, because he only made about 12 of those portraits. But they are really the beginning of street photography in the 20th century. And Alfred Stieglitz published these in Camera Work the year that he made them, in 1916. And Walker Evans, years later, remembered seeing Blind Woman. And he said, you know, I thought if that's photography, that's what I want to do.
It was at the end of the 10s, in 1990, I think, that he acquired another camera that
yes,
was
his view camera. One of the first series he made are his portraits of Rebecca Salisbury, who he had fallen in love with and married in 1921. And I think what I love about them is that you see all the different aspects of this individual as he knew her. You see this demure young lady, you see this sort of these moments of passion or very intense closeness.
And then there is a big change from the work of this moment to the 30s.
There's a very big change. I should say that Strand, Stieglitz, as I said, made fun of him for being so slow with his work. And Stieglitz felt that he was repetitive. But if you watch, you'll see that Strand was sort of accumulating motifs that mattered to him. When he goes to Mexico in 1932, he had become much more politically conscious. Strand had always been a man of the left, but with the onset of the Great Depression, like many artists, he felt it was imperative that art have social and political content at that moment. So he goes to Mexico, not really knowing what he's going to do, and he ended up staying for almost 3 years. And it's during that time that he devotes himself to filmmaking. But first he makes this amazing group of photographs where he brings portraiture back into his work. And he would go to a town square and set the camera up and then wait maybe for a half an hour until everybody around got used to him and stopped paying so much attention. And then he would open the camera and make these just amazing portraits.
Looks,
And by the 1940s, after the war ended, first of all, he had his first retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. And it's then that he decided that what he had done in Mexico actually would work in the future, that he could spend a lot of time photographing a place, really getting to know it, and then make what he thought of as a portrait of a place.
Yes.
And that shaped the rest of his work for the second half of his career. He had always had the idea of photographing a single village. He had probably been thinking about this since the 1910s. And he became close to the Italian neorealist filmmakers, especially Cesare Zavattini, who was the screenwriter for Bicycle Thief. And Zavattini ultimately suggested his own hometown of Luzzara, which is this wonderful little town on the Po River. Strand wrote to Nancy Newhall that it was, basically said it was no place special, and that was precisely what he wanted. He didn't want monuments or big Roman ruins. He wanted just a town where people were living their lives today in the 1950s. And it's very much a work of art about the present, and the present being post-war Italy, when of course they had just gone through this horrible war.
And in those portraits, Strand really prepared the composition. He was really taking care of every small detail that was going to be part of the image.
Absolutely.
So it's not anything was left.
This is not street photography.
No.
So this is the opposite of Robert Frank or later on Gary Winogrand and Lee Friedlander. Strand, he's more like Irving Penn. It's like he has a studio and he would select items of clothing for people to wear. He would scout out the background that he wanted for a picture.
One of his last photo books was, well, he traveled very much to Africa, well, very much, but to Africa in that moment.
Yes.
And he was also looking for those countries that at that moment they were having a political change.
Yes, and Strand had always hoped, since he moved to France, he hoped to do a project with a Soviet country. And he wanted a Soviet author, and he was very clear that he, as an American artist, wanted to collaborate with a Soviet writer to demonstrate that the two superpowers could collaborate. And finally, when he was 70, he and Hazel decided that they would go to Ghana. And Strand was excited about Nkrumah's politics. Nkrumah was sort of kept distant both from the US and the Soviet Union, and wanted to find what he called an African way, and was very quickly modernizing the country. And this also, I think, Strand loved. And when I look at the Ghana pictures, I always think that Strand, it was as if he could be in New England in the 18th century, when a democracy was taking shape and forming. So he was really drawn to the crowds of people that were out in public spaces debating political issues. So there are a lot of group photographs, and it's really kind of lively work, which we don't usually think of with Strand.
Yes.